The sun rose gently over Willow Creek, casting a golden glow on the quaint town. Birds chirped in the distance as the church bells rang, calling the faithful to service. Families, dressed in their Sunday best, strolled toward the white steepled church, their laughter mingling with the crisp morning air. Inside, Deacon Thomas Grayson stood at the pulpit, his warm smile radiating kindness. His voice, steady and soothing, filled the room as he spoke of morality and forgiveness. "We are all flawed," he said, his eyes scanning the congregation. "But through faith we find redemption." The crowd nodded, moved by his words. Among them sat Emily Carter, a 17-year-old with a distant look in her eyes. She clutched her Bible tightly, her mind elsewhere. As the service ended, Emily lingered near the church steps, her gaze fixed on the ground. Thomas approached her, his expression gentle. "Emily, is everything all right?" he asked, placing a hand on her shoulder. She flinched slightly but forced a smile. "I'm fine, Deacon. Just thinking." Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with concern. "If you ever need to talk, my door is always open." Emily watched him walk away, her heart heavy. That evening, her mother, Linda Carter, called the police. "Emily never came home," she sobbed. "She's never done this before." The town sprang into action. Search parties scoured the streets, while Thomas led a prayer circle at the church. "Lord, guide us to Emily," he intoned, his voice trembling with emotion. The next morning a shout echoed through the woods near the church. A search volunteer had found Emily's body, partially hidden beneath a pile of leaves. Her lifeless eyes stared at the sky, her hands clutching a small cross necklace. The news spread like wildfire. Willow Creek, once a haven of peace, was now a town gripped by fear. Detective Sarah Mitchell arrived at the scene, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "This wasn't random," she muttered to her partner. "Someone knew her." The townspeople gathered, their faces pale with shock. "Who could do this?" someone whispered. Back at the station, Sarah examined Emily's backpack. Inside, she found a folded note addressed to Deacon Grayson. Her brow furrowed as she read the scrawled words, "I know what you did. I can't keep quiet anymore." Sarah's mind raced. She called Thomas in for questioning, her tone polite but firm. "Do you know why Emily would write this?" she asked, sliding the note across the table. Thomas's face remained calm, but his hands trembled slightly. "I counseled her, like I do many others. She was troubled, but I never imagined." Sarah leaned forward. "Did she ever mention feeling threatened? Or afraid of someone?" Thomas shook his head. She seemed lost. But I tried to help her." That night Thomas returned home, his wife Margaret waiting anxiously. "What did they want?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. "Just routine questions," he replied, kissing her forehead. "Nothing to worry about." But as Margaret slept, Thomas slipped into the backyard. Under the cover of darkness, he burned a pile of blood-stained clothing, his face expressionless. The flames cast eerie shadows, revealing a side of him no one in Willow Creek had ever seen. The camera lingered on the dying embers, then cut to Thomas standing in the church, his hands clasped in prayer. "Forgive me, Father," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The screen faded to black, leaving the audience with a chilling question. How could a man of God harbor such darkness? Thomas Grayson was the epitome of virtue in Willow Creek. A devoted husband to Margaret and a loving father to 2 teenagers. He was the cornerstone of the community. His sermons at the local church were legendary, filled with wisdom and compassion. One Sunday, He stood before the congregation, his voice steady, yet impassioned. "We all carry burdens," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "But through faith, we can overcome even the darkest of sins." The crowd nodded, their admiration evident. Yet, as Thomas spoke of redemption, a flicker of unease crossed his face, a hint of something deeper, something darker. Emily Carter sat in the back pew, her fingers tracing the edges of her Bible. At 17, she was bright but burdened, her parents' recent divorce leaving her adrift. She often lingered after services, seeking solace in the quiet of the church. One evening, she approached Thomas. "Deacon Grayson, can I talk to you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Of course, Emily," he replied, his tone gentle. "My door is always open." In his office, Emily poured out her heart, her loneliness palpable. Thomas listened intently, his expression a mix of concern and something else, something she couldn't quite place. At home, Thomas's life was less idyllic. Margaret watched him from the kitchen window as he returned late yet again, his face shadowed. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "Just at the church," he replied, avoiding her gaze. "There's always work to be done." Margaret's eyes narrowed. She had noticed the locked drawer in his study, the late-night phone calls, the way he sometimes stared into the distance, lost in thought. One night, she confronted him. "Thomas, what's going on? You've been different." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's nothing, Margaret. Just the weight of the congregation's troubles." Emily began spending more time with Thomas, drawn to his comforting presence. Their conversations grew personal, with Thomas sharing stories of his own struggles. "Sometimes," he said one evening, "we must confront our darkest secrets to find peace." Emily leaned in, her curiosity piqued. "What secrets, Deacon?" He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Perhaps another time." Her mother, Linda, noticed the change in Emily. "You've been spending a lot of time with Deacon Grayson," she remarked one day. Emily shrugged. "He understands me." Linda frowned but said nothing, her unease growing. Willow Creek was a town of contradictions. Beneath its picturesque surface lay a web of gossip and judgment. Emily's friends noticed her withdrawal, but were unsure how to help. "Have you talked to Emily lately?" one asked. "She's always with Deacon Grayson," another replied. "It's weird." At the church, Thomas's sermons grew more intense, his words laced with urgency. "We must confront the sin within ourselves," he declared, his voice echoing through the sanctuary. The congregation shifted uncomfortably, sensing a tension they couldn't quite name. Late one night, Thomas stood in his backyard, a pile of old photographs in his hands. He struck a match, watching as the flames consumed the images, faces of young women, their smiles frozen in time. The next day, a church volunteer overheard a conversation between Thomas and Emily. "You can trust me," Thomas said, his voice low. "No one else needs to know." The volunteer hesitated, a chill running down her spine, but she dismissed it, unwilling to believe the worst of their beloved Deacon. Margaret's suspicions deepened. She found herself searching Thomas's study, her hands trembling as she tried the locked drawer. Inside, she found a journal filled with cryptic entries. "The sins of the flesh are the hardest to purge," one entry read. That night, she confronted him. "Thomas, what is this?" she demanded, holding up the journal. His face paled. "Margaret, that's private." "Private?" she shot back. "You're hiding something." "I can feel it." Thomas reached for her, but she pulled away. I don't know who you are anymore, she whispered, tears in her eyes. Detective Sarah Mitchell arrived in Willow Creek with a reputation for cracking tough cases. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, and her no-nonsense demeanor immediately set her apart from the local officers. Tell me everything, she said, flipping through the initial reports on Emily Carter's disappearance. Officer Jenkins hesitated. Deacon Grayson's been helping with the search. He's a good man. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Good men don't always tell the whole truth. Let's start with him. As she dug deeper, inconsistencies emerged. Witnesses recalled Emily's troubled demeanor, but no one wanted to point fingers, especially not at the town's beloved Deacon. Sarah's investigation took a dark turn when she discovered 2 unsolved cases from years prior. Both victims were young women who had sought counseling from Thomas Grayson. This can't be a coincidence, Sarah muttered, spreading the files across her desk. Her partner, Detective Harris, frowned. You think Grayson's involved? I think he's been hiding in plain sight, she replied, her voice grim. The similarities were undeniable. All 3 women had vanished after confiding in Thomas. Sarah's instincts screamed that she was dealing with a predator who had perfected his mask of piety. Flashbacks revealed Thomas's childhood, a bleak existence under the thumb of his fanatically religious father. You're born in sin, his father would sneer, locking him in the basement for hours. Only through suffering can you be cleansed. As a young man, Thomas internalized this warped ideology. He believed it was his duty to purify sinners even if it meant destroying them. In the present, Thomas stood before his congregation, his voice trembling with fervor. We must confront the darkness within ourselves, he preached, unaware that his own darkness was about to be exposed. Emily sat across from Thomas in his office, her hands clasped tightly. I feel so lost, she admitted. Thomas leaned forward, his expression kind. You're not alone, Emily. I'm here to guide you. Over time, their sessions grew more personal. Thomas shared stories of his own struggles, creating a bond that felt almost fatherly. But Emily began to notice subtle changes. His lingering touches, the way his eyes darkened when she spoke of her friends. One evening, she hesitated at his door. Deacon Grayson, I think I need to stop coming here. His smile faltered. Why would you say that? Margaret Grayson stood in the attic, a dusty box in her hands. Inside she found newspaper clippings about the missing women, a lock of Emily's hair, and a journal filled with Thomas's handwriting. She was impure, one entry read. I had to save her. Margaret's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages, each word more horrifying than the last. Thomas, she whispered, her voice breaking. What have you done? She sank to the floor, torn between loyalty to her husband and the horrifying truth staring back at her. That night, Margaret confronted Thomas in their living room. I found your box, she said, her voice shaking. Thomas froze, his face pale. Margaret, you don't understand. Don't lie to me, she shouted, tears streaming down her face. Those women, Emily. What did you do to them? He reached for her, but she stepped back. I was helping them, he insisted. They were lost and I... Stop, she cried. You're not a savior, Thomas. You're a monster. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging between them. Rumors about Thomas's possible involvement spread like wildfire. Some defended him fiercely, while others began to question his true nature. He's a man of God, one parishioner argued. He'd never hurt anyone. But Emily's friends weren't convinced. They organized a vigil, demanding justice. At the church, Thomas addressed the growing tension. "We must not let fear divide us," he said, his voice calm. "Forgiveness is the path to healing." His words swayed many, but Sarah watched from the back, her jaw clenched. "He's good," she muttered. "Too good." The following Sunday, Thomas delivered a powerful sermon. "Judge not, lest ye be judged," he intoned, his eyes scanning the congregation. Sarah sat in the back, her gaze fixed on him. She noticed the subtle tremor in his hands, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. After the service, she approached him. "Deacon Grayson, we need to talk." He smiled warmly. "Of course, Detective. How can I help?" But Sarah wasn't fooled. She had the evidence, and she was ready to bring him down. Back at the station, Sarah reviewed the evidence. DNA from Emily's body, trophies hidden in Thomas's car, and the journal Margaret had provided. Her superiors were hesitant. "He's a respected figure," one warned. "We need to be sure." Sarah slammed her fist on the table. "I am sure. He's a killer, and he's been hiding behind that collar for years." With a warrant in hand, she prepared to confront Thomas, her determination unwavering. Sarah interviewed Emily's mother, Linda, one last time. "Did Emily ever mention anything about Deacon Grayson?" she asked. Linda hesitated. "She said he shared secrets with her. Things she couldn't tell anyone else." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "What kind of secrets?" "I don't know," Linda admitted. But she was scared of him at the end. That was all Sarah needed. With the final piece of the puzzle in place, she set her plan in motion. Detective Sarah Mitchell stood in the evidence room, her eyes fixed on the DNA report. The results were clear. Thomas Grayson's DNA matched the samples found on Emily Carter's body. Next to the report lay items from a hidden compartment in Thomas's car: a lock of hair, a bracelet, and a small notebook filled with names. Sarah's jaw tightened as she flipped through the pages. She gathered her team. "We've got him," she said, her voice steady. "Thomas Grayson is our killer. It's time to bring him in." The room buzzed with tension as they prepared for the arrest. Sarah knew arresting Thomas wouldn't be easy. He was a beloved figure, and the town would rally behind him. "We'll take him during the Sunday service," she told her team. "It's public, but it'll minimize the chance of resistance." Officer Jenkins frowned. "The congregation won't take kindly to this." "They'll have to deal with it," Sarah replied. "We can't let him slip away." As the team finalized the plan, Sarah's mind raced. She had to be ready for anything. Thomas was cunning, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. The church was packed, the air thick with the sound of hymns. Thomas stood at the pulpit, his voice resonating through the sanctuary. "We are all sinners," he declared, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But through faith, we can be redeemed." Unseen by the congregation, police officers quietly surrounded the building. Sarah entered through the side door, her badge glinting in the dim light. As Thomas reached the climax of his sermon, Sarah stepped forward. "Thomas Grayson," she announced, her voice cutting through the silence. "You're under arrest for the murder of Emily Carter and others." Gasps filled the room. Thomas froze, his hands gripping the pulpit. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice trembling. Sarah approached him, her gaze unwavering. "No mistake, Deacon. The evidence doesn't lie." As she cuffed him, the congregation erupted in chaos. In the interrogation room, Thomas sat calmly, his hands folded on the table. Sarah sat across from him, her expression stern. "Why did you do it, Thomas?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "I was doing God's work. Those girls, They were lost. I saved them from their sins. Sarah leaned forward. By killing them. By purifying them. He corrected, his tone disturbingly serene. They were impure, detective. I gave them redemption. Sarah's stomach churned. You're not a savior, Thomas. You're a murderer. His smile faded. You wouldn't understand. You're not chosen, like I am. Sarah stood, her voice cold. You're chosen, all right. Chosen to spend the rest of your life in prison. As she left the room, Thomas's calm facade cracked, revealing the monster beneath. Outside the police station, Margaret faced a crowd of reporters, her face pale but determined. My husband is not the man you think he is, she began, her voice shaking. He's a killer, a monster who hid behind his faith. The crowd murmured in shock. Margaret continued, her words cutting through the air like a knife. I loved him, but I can't defend him. Not after what he's done. Inside the station, Thomas watched from a window, his face a mask of disbelief. For the first time, he looked truly alone. The town of Willow Creek was in turmoil. Vigils were held for Emily and the other victims, their faces illuminated by candlelight. He betrayed us, one mourner said, tears streaming down her face. How could we not see it? The church, once a beacon of hope, stood empty, its doors locked. The community grappled with the betrayal, their grief mingling with anger. Sarah watched from a distance, her heart heavy. Justice had been served, but the scars would remain. A flashback revealed Emily's last moments. She stood in the woods, her breath visible in the cold air. Thomas approached, his expression calm. Deacon Grayson, she said, her voice trembling. I don't want to do this anymore. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It's too late, Emily. You've already been chosen. She turned to run, but he was faster. The scene faded to black, leaving only the sound of her desperate cries. Emily's tragic end served as a haunting reminder of the darkness that had lurked in their midst. The courtroom was a pressure cooker of tension, every seat filled with reporters, townsfolk, and the families of the victims. Thomas sat at the defense table, his face a mask of calm indifference, but his hands betrayed him, trembling slightly under the table. The prosecution laid out the case with surgical precision. The chilling confession, the trophies found in his car, each item a macabre souvenir of a life taken. Your Honor, the prosecutor began, her voice steady but laced with venom. This man didn't just take lives, he stole futures, shattered families, and betrayed the trust of an entire community. Thomas's lawyer, a weary man with bags under his eyes, tried to argue diminished capacity, but the jury wasn't buying it. The verdict came swiftly, guilty on all counts. As the judge handed down the sentence, life without parole, Thomas's mask finally cracked. His jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, his eyes flickered with something like fear. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. In the gallery, Linda Carter clutched her daughter's photograph, her knuckles white. It's over, she whispered, though her voice carried no relief. Willow Creek was a town unraveling. The church, once the heart of the community, stood half empty on Sundays. Some parishioners couldn't bear to step inside, the pews now a reminder of betrayal rather than solace. At the local diner, conversations were hushed but heated. How could we not have seen it? One man muttered, stirring his coffee absently. We didn't want to see it, his companion replied, her voice bitter. We trusted him because he wore a collar. But amidst the anger and disillusionment, there were glimmers of hope. A group of residents organized a memorial for the victims. their names etched into a stone monument in the town square. Support groups sprang up, offering a safe space for those struggling to make sense of the tragedy. "We can't let him take everything from us," one woman said at a town meeting, her voice trembling but resolute. "We have to rebuild. For them." Linda Carter stood at the podium, her hands steady but her heart racing. The room was packed, every eye on her. "Emily was more than a victim," she began, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes. "She was a light, and I won't let that light go out." Her foundation, Emily's Light, quickly gained traction. It offered counseling, scholarships, and resources for young women in abusive situations. Linda threw herself into the work, her grief channeled into something tangible, something meaningful. One evening, after a long day of meetings, she sat alone in her living room, Emily's photo on the mantel. "I'm doing this for you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I just wish you were here to see it." Margaret stood in the empty house, the echoes of her children's laughter still lingering in the walls. She had packed up their lives into a handful of boxes, each one a step toward a new beginning. "Are you sure about this?" her sister asked, watching her load the last box into the car. "I can't stay here," Margaret replied, her voice firm. "Not after everything." She moved to a small town hundreds of miles away, where no one knew her name or her story. It was there, in the quiet of her new life, that she began to write. Her memoir, Behind the Collar, was raw and unflinching, a stark exposé of the man she had once called her husband. When the book became a bestseller, Margaret found herself in the spotlight once again. But this time, it was on her terms. "I wrote it because people need to know," she said in an interview, her voice steady. "They need to see that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the people we trust the most." The camera lingered on the church, its steeple piercing the grey sky like a silent accusation. The doors, once thrown open in welcome, were now bolted shut. The windows, dark and lifeless, reflected the overcast clouds above. A single piece of yellow police tape fluttered in the wind, the last vestige of the chaos that had unfolded within. Inside, the pews sat empty, dust gathering on the hymnals. The altar, once a place of reverence, now felt like a stage for a grotesque performance. A faint echo of a hymn seemed to hang in the air, a ghostly reminder of the faith that had once filled the space. Outside, a lone figure stood in the shadow of the building. It was Margaret, her coat pulled tight against the chill. She stared at the church, her expression unreadable. "Do you ever wonder if it was all a lie?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her companion, a man from the support group she'd joined, shook his head. "Not all of it," he said. "The faith wasn't the lie. He was." Margaret didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the steeple. For a moment, it seemed as if she might say something more, but instead, she turned and walked away, leaving the church to its silence. The narrator's voice cut through the stillness, low and measured, as the camera panned away from the church. In the end, the voice began, the greatest sin was not the act of killing, but the betrayal of the very faith that bound them together. Thomas didn't just take lives, he shattered the trust of an entire community. He turned a sanctuary into a tomb. The screen faded to black, but the narrator's words lingered, heavy with implication. Evil doesn't always announce itself with a roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it wears a collar, and sometimes it's the person you least suspect. The final shot was of the church's steeple, now silhouetted against a setting sun. The image was haunting, a stark reminder of the fragility of trust and the darkness that can lurk behind even the most familiar faces. As the credits rolled, the audience was left with a single, unsettling thought. How well do we really know the people we trust? The story ended as it began, with a question, and in that question lay the true horror. The realization that the line between good and evil is often far thinner than we'd like to believe.